The warehouse never slept. The system tracked everything. So when a man died inside it, the system treated him like cargo. This is a murder processed by efficiency. Prologue. Order confirmed. The warehouse never slept. It did not need to. Lights stayed on at a level designed to keep people alert but not comfortable. White, slightly cold, calibrated to reduce shadows between shelves that stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. The air smelled of cardboard, plastic wrap, and something faintly metallic, the scent of efficiency. At 02:17 a.m., the night shift was at peak rhythm. Scanners beeped in short, disciplined intervals. Conveyor belts hummed like restrained machinery, moving thousands of identical brown boxes along predetermined paths. Workers moved fast, heads down, eyes trained not on space, but on screens strapped to their wrists. Every movement was counted, every step was measured, every mistake was logged. The body was found in aisle 47. That, in itself, was not remarkable. The aisles were narrow, tall, indistinguishable. 47 looked exactly like 46 and 48, a canyon of shelves rising upward, stacked with sealed goods, labeled and indexed with machine precision. What was remarkable was how long it took for anyone to notice. The picker who found him froze. He stood with his scanner still raised, the green light glowing softly against the cardboard in front of him. The system had just assigned him the next item, row 47, slot D19, and he had followed the arrow without thinking. That was how the warehouse trained people. Do not look around, look forward, follow instructions. When his eyes finally adjusted, he understood that something was wrong. The man was lying on his side, half hidden between the lower shelves. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, pressed awkwardly against the floor. His badge was still clipped to his vest. Manager, Night Operations. The picker did not scream. He did not run. He simply stood there, waiting for the scanner to tell him what to do next. It didn't. Security arrived 6 minutes later. 6 minutes was fast by warehouse standards. The building was large. Sound did not travel well. People rarely raised their voices. The body had not moved. No blood pooled on the floor. No visible weapon. No sign of struggle. Just a man who should not have been there, lying where the system insisted no one ever stayed for long. By 02:41 a.m., the conveyor belts were stopped. That alone caused more panic than the body. Orders backed up. Timers blinked red. Supervisors argued quietly near terminals, already calculating delays and penalties. Somewhere in the building, an automated voice announced a temporary halt in fulfillment operations. The words sounded clinical. The effect was not. The initial conclusion formed quickly. Medical episode. Collapse. Stress. The night shift was brutal. Everyone knew that. Managers worked longer hours than anyone else, moving constantly, pressured by metrics that never slept. A heart attack between shelves was unfortunate, but not implausible. Except for one detail. The man had not scanned anything in the last 23 minutes. That was unusual. Managers were not required to scan every step, but they rarely went silent for that long. The system tracked proximity, movement, task assignments. Silence meant absence, or concealment. The footage complicated things. Cameras covered every main aisle, every junction, every conveyor intersection. The man was seen entering aisle 47 at 01:54 a.m. He was alone. He did not leave. No one entered after him. At least, no one the system recognized as a person. By 03:12 a.m., the warehouse director had arrived. By 03:40 a.m., corporate had been notified. By 04:05 a.m., the word incident replaced death in all internal communications. And by 04:23 a.m., something else happened, something no one could explain. A sealed package reached the outbound scanning station. Standard size, standard weight, standard routing. The system flagged it automatically. Return, processing error. It was redirected back into the warehouse flow, rolling gently onto a secondary conveyor that led back toward storage. No human intervention, just efficiency correcting itself. When the box was opened later that morning, it contained something that was not on any inventory list, something that had already been found once. At 06:11 a.m., Edward Hale received the call. He listened without interrupting. A warehouse, a body, total surveillance, no entry, no exit. Then the voice added one more detail. A package, the caller said, carefully. It went out, and then it came back. Edward was silent for a moment. Then he asked a single question. Did the system think it was merchandise? Chapter 1. A perfect system. Edward Hale arrived at the warehouse after sunrise, when the night shift had already dissolved into silence and the day shift was pretending nothing unusual had happened. The building looked calm from the outside, rectangular, anonymous, efficient. No windows where they weren't needed, no entrances that invited hesitation. A place designed to move objects, not questions. Inside, the air felt controlled. Temperature, humidity, light, everything tuned to reduce friction. The floor shone with the dull polish of constant cleaning. Lines on the ground directed foot traffic with the confidence of authority. Edward noticed how few people looked up. They walked with purpose because the system told them where to go. The warehouse director met him near a bank of terminals, hands folded, voice steady. He spoke in numbers first. Throughput, downtime, loss mitigation. Edward listened and nodded, then asked for the thing no one liked to discuss. "Show me how you see people," Edward said. The director hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. The interface was elegant in its cruelty. Every worker appeared as a moving dot, tagged with an ID, task, and countdown. The dots flowed through aisles like particles in a simulation, splitting and merging where the layout demanded it. The system did not show faces, it did not show hesitation, it did not show fatigue. Edward leaned closer. "And managers?" Edward asked. The director tapped a filter. A different color appeared. Fewer dots, faster paths, longer dwell times near intersections. The system assumed managers were exceptions. It gave them latitude, not privacy. Edward smiled faintly. "Latitude creates blind faith," he said. They replayed the last hour before the body was found. The manager's dot entered aisle 47 and slowed, then stopped. The system did not panic. It never did. A stationary dot was not an error. It was a pause. Pauses happened. Pauses were human. The system waited. Edward watched the pause stretch. 5 minutes, 10, 23. "What happens when a dot stops moving?" Edward asked. "It depends," the director said. "If a task is assigned, it flags a delay. If not, it assumes oversight." Edward nodded, and oversight is invisible. They switched to camera feeds. Aisle 47 appeared clean and tall, shelves stacked high enough to turn sound into suggestion. The manager entered alone. He walked with the relaxed authority of someone who belonged there. He did not look around. He did not check behind him. He trusted the place. Edward paused the footage. Who else was nearby? The director layered the data. dots clustered in adjacent aisles, moving in strict patterns. No one crossed into 47, no one lingered at the ends. The system approved the solitude. Edward felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes. The system didn't see a crowd, it saw efficiency. They examined the scanners next. Wrist-mounted devices chirped when items were picked, when boxes were sealed, when hands passed where they were allowed. Edward noticed the absence more than the presence. The manager had no scan for 23 minutes. The system accepted that because it accepted hierarchy. Managers supervised. Supervisors did not need to prove movement. Edward wrote a line in his notebook. Authority is the first exemption. He asked about inspections. The director explained the exit protocols, metal detectors, random checks, cameras, nothing left without being seen. Edward asked him to repeat it slower. The director complied. Nothing leaves without being seen, Edward said, tasting the phrase. What about things that don't look like leaving? They moved to the outbound lanes, conveyors braided together like arteries, feeding stations that weighed, labeled, and judged boxes with mechanical indifference. Edward watched a package pass under a scanner and become a decision. Approved, routed, gone. Edward said, "Show me the returns." The director frowned, then pulled another screen. A quieter flow appeared. Items that had already been sent away and then corrected by the system. Wrong address, damaged label, timing conflict. The machine brought them back without asking permission. Edward pointed. "Your system admits mistakes," he said. "They just don't call them that." They returned to the footage of aisle 47. Edward zoomed in on the lower shelves, the blind space where boxes waited to be chosen. He noticed how the camera angle respected inventory over people. The shelves were clear. The floor was secondary. "When was the aisle last restocked?" Edward asked. "During the shift," the director said. "Automated replenishment." Edward nodded. Automated meant scheduled. Scheduled meant predictable. He asked for the replenishment log. The time aligned with the manager's silence. A pallet moved through a cross aisle near 47, its path approved, its sensors satisfied. No one questioned it because pallets were expected. Pallets belonged. Edward closed the file. "Your system is perfect," he said. The director relaxed a fraction. Compliments mattered. "It tracks everything," the director agreed. Edward met his eyes. "No," he said gently. "It tracks compliance." They stood in silence while the conveyors resumed their hum. The building exhaled. Orders moved. The day shift returned to rhythm. Somewhere, a box rolled along, indistinguishable from the rest. Edward wrote the last line of the chapter with care. In a perfect system, the crime doesn't break the rules, it follows them. Chapter 2. The Human Shortcut. Edward Hale did not begin with suspects. He began with habits. Systems were designed by people who believed in rules. They assumed that if the rules were clear enough, humans would follow them. Edward had learned the opposite early in his career. Humans followed shortcuts, not rules, especially when the rules were impossible to live with. The warehouse looked calm in daylight, orderly, almost polite, but Edward knew that calm was cosmetic. Underneath it lived pressure, measured, quantified, relentless. He walked the aisles with a shift supervisor named Elena, a woman in her early 30s who had learned how to keep moving without appearing rushed. "How long is a standard shift?" Edward asked. 12 hours, she said, sometimes more. "And breaks?" he asked. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Breaks are tracked," she said, "like everything else." Edward nodded. "So people don't stop," he said. "They slow down," Elena corrected, "when they can." They stopped near a junction where 3 aisles met. Workers passed through without looking at each other, scanners chirping softly, wrists flicking with mechanical efficiency. Edward noticed the way some of them stepped just outside the painted lines on the floor. "That allowed?" he asked. Elena glanced down. Technically, no, she said. Practically, everyone does it. Edward wrote a word in his notebook. Drift. Elena showed him the unofficial paths, between shelves where the camera coverage overlapped imperfectly, along the backs of pallets where scanners lost line of sight for half a second, near loading bays where noise drowned out alarms that were never meant to be heard over machinery. These aren't blind spots, Edward said. Elena shook her head. They are tolerated spots, she said. The system knows they exist. It just pretends they don't. Edward nodded slowly. A shortcut only works if both sides agree not to talk about it. Edward spoke with pickers next. They did not complain. Complaints were logged. They spoke instead about efficiency, about shaving seconds, about tricks that made quotas survivable. Sometimes the scanner lags, one man said casually. You learn when to move anyway. Sometimes the conveyor pauses. You step over instead of waiting. Edward listened. Every shortcut shared one feature. It was invisible to the system because the system needed it to be invisible. If it acknowledged the shortcut, it would have to acknowledge that the workload was unreasonable. Edward wrote, "The system survives by ignoring survival tactics." Edward returned to aisle 47. In daylight, the aisle looked smaller, less dramatic, just shelves and labels and dustless floor. Edward crouched and looked beneath the lowest rack. The blind zone was obvious now. Boxes blocked the camera's view of anything on the ground level for nearly a meter. Enough space for an object, enough space for a body. Edward stood. "How often do pallets move through here?" Edward asked. "Every 20 minutes, automated." "And do people step into the aisle during that?" Edward asked. "All the time. You wait for the pallet, then you move behind it. Saves time." Edward closed his eyes briefly. The picture was forming. Edward examined the scan logs. He noticed how often scans overlapped with movement events that the system smoothed out. A delay here, a correction there. Human error normalized by algorithmic forgiveness. Edward circled a timestamp. "Here," he said, "this picker scanned an item that wasn't in his hand." Elena leaned closer. He was grabbing it. The scan registered early. Edward nodded. And the system allowed it. Edward returned to the question everyone avoided. "Could someone move through the aisle without being logged?" Edward asked. Elena hesitated. "Not officially," she said. Edward waited. "But," she added quietly, "if you move when the system expects movement, it doesn't ask questions." Edward wrote, "Expectation replaces verification." Edward reconstructed the manager's final minutes. He entered the aisle with authority the system respected. He paused where pauses were allowed. Around him, pallets moved, scanners chirped, cameras watched shelves instead of floors. Someone else moved too, not against the flow, with it. Edward closed his notebook. The manager had not been alone. He had been surrounded by activity the system did not count as presence. Edward looked down the aisle one last time. "What people call blind spots," he said quietly, "are just places where the system has decided not to look." Elena did not argue. She had worked there long enough to know the truth. Edward ended the chapter with a realization that hardened the case. The murder had not required hacking or sabotage. It had required understanding how people bent the rules to survive and how the system rewarded them for it. Edward wrote the final line carefully. The killer didn't break the system. He used the shortcuts everyone else depended on. Chapter 3. The Conveyor Doesn't Care. Edward Hale stood beside the main conveyor line and listened. It was not loud, not in the way people imagined machines to be. The sound was constant, even, almost comforting, a low mechanical breath punctuated by soft impacts as boxes met rollers, diverters, scanners, a rhythm designed to fade into the background of human attention. That was its danger. People reacted to sudden noises. They ignored continuity. The conveyor moved at a speed calculated to be efficient but not alarming, fast enough that hesitation mattered, slow enough that nothing looked violent. Edward watched a package slide past. Cardboard, plastic wrap, label facing up. Approved. "The belt never stops," the operations engineer said proudly, "not unless something catastrophic happens." Edward nodded. "And what counts as catastrophic?" Edward asked. The engineer smiled. "Fire, power failure, structural damage." Edward watched another package pass. "And a human?" Edward asked. The smile faded. They reviewed the conveyor logic. Sensors tracked weight, shape, balance. If something deviated beyond tolerance, it was rejected, diverted, corrected. Edward leaned in. "What happens," he asked, "if something fits the tolerance but shouldn't be there?" The engineer hesitated. "It passes," he said. Edward wrote, "Tolerance is permission." Edward walked along the belt. He noted the points where the conveyor dipped, rose, narrowed, places where items briefly disappeared from view before re-emerging further down the line. He noticed how the camera coverage favored labels and barcodes, not surfaces. The system cared about information, not content. Edward crouched near a junction where two belts merged. "If someone fell here, how long before anyone noticed?" he asked casually. The frown faded. "People aren't supposed to be here," he said. Edward looked up. That wasn't the question. Edward examined the maintenance reports. The belt had been recalibrated 2 weeks earlier to handle heavier loads. The acceptable weight range had been increased slightly, not enough to raise alarms, enough to matter. Edward underlined the entry. "Who approved this?" he asked. The engineer checked. "Night operations, manager's request." Edward closed the file. Edward reconstructed the sequence. The manager enters aisle 47. A pallet moves through on schedule. The conveyor continues its indifferent progress. At some point, the manager is no longer upright. The system does not register a fall. It registers an object. Objects belonged here. Edward followed the belt to the packaging station. Here, machines wrapped items in plastic, sealed them, weighed them, judged them. Human hands intervened only when something broke the pattern. Edward watched a box get sealed. The machine did not hesitate. It did not ask what was inside. Edward wrote, "Automation removes curiosity." The box containing the body would not have looked different at first. Weight within tolerance, shape acceptable, label clean. The conveyor did not care that the content had once been a person. It cared that the content complied. Edward reviewed the timestamp. The box was sealed at 02:19 a.m., 2 minutes after the body was found. That was not a contradiction. That was the key. Edward realized the truth then. The body had not been found first. It had been processed first. The discovery in aisle 47 was what remained after the system had already done its work. Edward closed his eyes briefly. People assumed violence happened before logistics. They were wrong. Edward examined the return log again. The package had left the warehouse cleanly. Outbound scan confirmed. Vehicle loaded. Route assigned. Then, 37 minutes later, return, processing error. No explanation, no human intervention, just a correction. Edward asked to see the criteria. The logistics analyst hesitated before pulling up the screen. It's a composite, she said. Multiple factors: weight variance, scan latency, routing confidence. Edward nodded. Which one triggered the return? He asked. The analyst swallowed. We don't know, she said. The system doesn't isolate it. It just reacts. Edward wrote, opacity protects authority. Edward traced the path of the package backward, from outbound lane to packaging to conveyor merge to aisle 47. At each stage, the system had made a decision. At no stage had a human been asked to confirm it. Edward examined the weight profile. The box had been sealed at the upper limit of tolerance, not enough to stop it, enough to make it fragile in the algorithm's confidence model. Edward pointed at the curb. This box was always going to come back, he said quietly. The analyst frowned. We ship heavier items all the time, she said. Edward nodded. But not like this, he replied. Edward realized something crucial. The killer had not relied on the return. The killer had predicted it. If the box had been delivered, it would have raised questions. A damaged package, a failed delivery, human review. But a return? Returns disappeared into process. Edward wrote, returns are processed, not examined. Edward spoke to the returns supervisor next, a man who knew more about lost items than found ones. What happens to returned packages? Edward asked. They're reintroduced, the man said. Scanned, sorted, redistributed. And inspected? Edward asked. Only if there's visible damage, the supervisor said. Edward nodded. And if there isn't? He asked. The supervisor shrugged. They go back into inventory flow. Edward closed his notebook. The body had traveled unseen twice, once forward, once backward. Edward returned to the moment of discovery, the body in aisle 47. It had not been the original crime scene. It had been the afterimage, what remained after the system corrected itself. Edward overlaid timelines. The manager stopped scanning. The conveyor recalibration engaged. The pallet moved. The box was sealed. The system hesitated. The return triggered. Each step depended on the one before it, not coincidence, design. Edward confronted the logistics analyst with the question she feared. Who understands the return thresholds well enough to plan around them? Edward asked. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said it. Night operations, managers, optimization leads, anyone who reviews exception reports. Edward nodded. The circle tightened. Edward visited the optimization office. Empty now, screens dark, but the whiteboard remained. Metrics, targets, reductions. In the corner, written smaller than the rest. Return rate under 0.3%. Edward stared at it. The system did not want returns, but it tolerated them. That tolerance was exploitable. Edward understood then why the manager had been chosen. Not random, not personal, strategic. He knew the numbers. He knew when the system would correct itself quietly. Edward wrote the conclusion carefully. The return wasn't a failure. It was the final step of the plan. Edward closed the chapter with the realization that completed the logic. The warehouse had not hidden the body. It had handled it, just like everything else. Edward wrote the final line. In a system designed to fix mistakes, murder can look like maintenance. Chapter 5. Who benefits from efficiency? Edward never asked who hated the victim. Hatred was noisy, inefficient. It leaked into places where systems noticed anomalies. Edward asked a quieter question. Who benefited when the manager stopped existing? The answer did not live in emotions. It lived in spreadsheets. Edward sat alone in the optimization office, surrounded by glass walls that made every thought feel observable. The screens were off, but their afterimage remained, the faint impression of graphs burned into memory by repetition. Targets, throughput, downtime reduction, labor variance. Edward reopened the reports from the previous quarter. The manager who died had been responsible for night operations, the most expensive shift. Higher injury rates, lower morale, more human error. His reports were detailed, uncomfortable, honest. Edward read one line twice. Current efficiency gains are achieved by exceeding sustainable human limits. Edward underlined it. Edward compared the reports written before and after the manager's death. The difference was immediate. Language softened. Concerns became opportunities. Risks were reclassified as acceptable variance. The system smiled again. Edward followed the chain upward. Optimization lead, regional director, corporate performance review. No one had ordered a death. That was the elegance of it. The system did not require commands. It required incentives. Edward interviewed the optimization lead late in the afternoon. A man who spoke quickly and smiled often. Someone who believed data was a moral force. "We're building something remarkable," the man said. "We remove inefficiency, we remove waste." Edward nodded. "And what about people?" he asked. The man hesitated just long enough. "People adapt," he said. Edward wrote, "Adaptation is a euphemism for replacement." Edward laid out the timeline, the conveyor recalibration request, the expanded weight tolerance, the return thresholds, all approved during budget optimization meetings, all justified, all legal. Edward did not accuse, he asked. Who knew the system well enough to trust it with something irreversible? Edward asked. The man swallowed. Edward moved lower. Shift supervisors, process analysts, return specialists. Each knew a piece. No one knew the whole. That was the design. Edward wrote, "Distributed knowledge prevents accountability." Edward returned to the warehouse floor one last time. The night shift was starting again. New faces, temporary contracts, different badges. The aisle where the body had been found looked ordinary now. Edward stood there and imagined the system without the manager. Faster approvals, fewer objections, cleaner metrics. The warehouse breathed easier. Edward understood then. The murder had not been planned by one person. It had been enabled by many. Each shortcut, each tolerance, each ignored warning. No one wanted the manager dead. They wanted him gone. Edward wrote his final conclusion in the case file. The killer did not seek secrecy. He relied on efficiency. He relied on the fact that a system designed to optimize outcomes would never stop to ask whether the outcome should exist. Edward closed the file. There would be consequences, reassignments, policy updates, a new safety memo. No arrests that satisfied the public, no villain to isolate, just a quiet recalibration. Edward left the warehouse as the conveyors resumed their steady rhythm. Boxes moved, orders flowed, returns corrected themselves. The system continued, unbothered. Edward wrote the last line of the chapter carefully. In a world that worships efficiency, the most expendable resource is always human attention. Epilogue. Delivered. The warehouse resumed full capacity within 48 hours. The conveyors never mentioned the interruption. The scanners did not remember it. The metrics recovered faster than anyone expected. Efficiency had a remarkable ability to heal itself. Edward Hale stood at the edge of the outbound zone and watched boxes move past him in disciplined rows, each one identical in shape, similar in weight, marked with destinations that meant nothing to the building itself. To the system, Every box was a promise fulfilled. Edward knew better. Some promises were never meant to be kept. The official conclusion was careful. No homicide, no single responsible party, a confluence of procedural failures. The phrase satisfied legal departments and unsettled no one who mattered. The warehouse issued a statement expressing regret. Corporate issued a memo emphasizing renewed commitment to safety. Training modules were updated. Nothing slowed down. The manager's desk was cleared, his access revoked, his credentials recycled, his name removed from shift planning software. Within a week, a replacement had been assigned. Younger, cheaper, more flexible. The system approved. Edward reviewed the final report one last time before closing the file. The body had moved through the warehouse twice, once as a problem, once as a correction. At no point had the system recognized it as a human being. Edward wrote a single sentence at the end of his notes. When people become inventory, death becomes logistics. Outside, delivery vans lined up in neat formation, engines idling. Drivers checked routes, scanned manifests, waited for confirmation tones that meant permission to proceed. A courier adjusted a strap on his shoulder and stepped inside. The door closed. The process continued. Edward turned away. He knew this case would not change how warehouses were built. It would not slow the belts or widen the margins of tolerance. The world preferred speed to reflection, outcomes to questions. This was not a failure of technology. It was a success of design. As Edward walked into the morning light, his phone vibrated. Another message, another location, another system that had worked exactly as intended. Edward did not sigh. He simply wrote the final line of the book in his notebook, then closed it. Nothing went wrong. That was the problem. He wasn't killed by a person. He was finished by a process. If you want more detective stories where crimes hide inside everyday systems, subscribe to the channel. The next case is already in motion.